So I don't know if you guys have heard, but there's some new data from CNN that could be quite startling for America's future prospects for aid to Ukraine. Not because the American, Congress people and the American senators and the presidency has turned against Ukraine. No, we're talking about the general population and polling numbers that have come out about their support for Ukraine, which has seemed to peter off at 50-50. At 50% supporting more aid to Ukraine and 50% saying we've sent enough aid to Ukraine. Let's read a little bit about this article, talk about the implications, and also talk about interesting things that happen when you start informing American voters more details about the war. Most Americans oppose congressional authority and additional funding to support Ukraine in its war with Russia, according to a new CNN poll conducted by SSRS, as the public splits over whether the U.S. has already done enough to assist Ukraine. 51% say that the U.S. has already done enough to help Ukraine, while 48% say that they should still do more. A poll conducted in the early days of the Russian invasion in February of 2022 found that 62% felt the U.S. should be doing more, and it was in the 30s for those who think that we've done enough. A majority, but not all, 68% of those who say the U.S. should do more to support Ukraine favor additional funding, as do 23% of those who say the U.S. has already done enough. When asked specifically about the type of assistance the U.S. could provide to Ukraine, there is broader support for help with intelligence gathering, 63%, and military training, 53%, okay? So a majority of Americans still support intelligence gathering and training more Ukrainian soldiers. 43% support providing more weapons, and a very small percent, 17%, support putting troops on the ground, which Biden has already pledged that he would not do. Most Americans who say the U.S. should be doing more to support Ukraine are in favor of providing assistance in intelligence gathering, 75%, military training, 68%, weapons, 60%, and while among those who say the U.S. has already done enough, only intelligence gathering has earned a majority of 52%. A majority of Americans do express concern that Russia's war in Ukraine will threaten U.S. national security interests. That's 56% of Americans believing that, which is down, though, significantly from February 2022, when it was 72%. So the majority of Americans has not bought in the Volshwami line and the earlier Ron DeSantis line, which he might slightly have reversed on, that it's not a key American national security interest. A bigger worry across partisan lines in the new poll is that the war will continue without a resolution for a long time. Nearly 8 in 10 are worried about that, including 82% of Democrats, 75% of independents, and 73% of Republicans. Nearly 2/3 overall are concerned that the war in Ukraine will lead to an increase to threats to democracy elsewhere, 65%, or lead to Russian attacks elsewhere, 64%. So American voters do know that the Russians might not stop with Ukraine, or that if they were to sign a peace deal right now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Russians wouldn't just start up the war again in 3-4 years once they've licked their wounds and the Ukrainians have already given up large swaths of territory, so they can expand upon their gains. And about 6 in 10 are worried it could lead to a broader war in Europe. It also goes down further. I don't want to get all into the minutiae of the data, but if you wanted to read the rest of the article, what the rest of the article basically says is that Democrats and Republicans are divided, with the majority of Democrats very hard line supporting Ukraine, while the majority of Republicans are starting to kind of wane on supporting Ukraine. That's different, though, when you looked at the elected Republicans and elected Democrats, with basically the entirety of the elected Democratic caucus supporting the Democratic Party continuing to support aid to Ukraine, with about 66% of elected Republicans supporting continued aid to Ukraine and 33% of elected Republicans starting to wane on it. If you look at the recent legislation that has been co-sponsored in the House by people like Matt Gaetz, or being pushed by Matt Gaetz to try to stop aid, Marjorie Taylor Greene, other people like that. Okay, so we went through all the data. What does this say? It says that over the last year and a half, a lot of the attention that was put on Ukraine has started to fade. People aren't hearing about the air raids going on every night, about the bombings and the atrocities that are going on every night as much as they used to. Now, some people, when I say this, they react to me very very kind of confused, saying, what do you mean? The lamestream media is always covering the war in Ukraine. But if you just look at the SEO on Twitter, or the SEO or any social media platform, and you look at the amount Ukraine is mentioned, it's drastically gone down. Drastically.
Has donated $5. Let's get an orangutan to run against Trump in the Republican candidates. Pipilau. Also take this change to rent yourself a nice laptop like
Dom. Oh, dude, that Dom guy on Twitter, man, he is a special kind of stupid you only find every once in a while, and just a bizarre conspiracy theorist. You know, he believes in that frazzle drip nonsense. What a fool. Anyway, back onto the topic. That amount of attention that the media and it was getting on social media has gone down. Now, some people would talk about possibly Ukraine being suppressed in the Twitter algorithm. I know a lot of Ukraine accounts talk about how Ukraine YouTube videos and Ukraine videos on Twitter, Ukraine content on Twitter, or posts about Ukraine on Twitter has somewhat been suppressed. But all of the data and all the information about that is not completely public, so it's hard to make those determination. We do know on Twitter, though, that's at least to some degree partially true. Not that it was purposely suppressed, but that the algorithm does not favor posts or information about Ukraine, right? Now, that could be one component, so that it's getting less attention, right? But I think another component, and this is the bigger component that we can push back on. We can try to bring more attention to it. That's the whole reason I'm here, is that we can try to bring more attention to it. But there's another component, and that other component, I think, is it's not being emphasized how much of the aid that we're giving them means in the broad picture. And let me give you an example of this. There was a poll recently done by, I think it was the Reagan Institute, and I am saying that up front because it is the Reagan Institute, so it's not the most completely unbiased source, and you can go check your methodology of their own. They polled, I think, 1,200 people. They did about half of them by phone. They did half of them by survey, but I do believe, even if these data is 100% accurate, that it is touching on something that I want to touch on, and I hope that other institutes, other think tanks, other organizations does follow-up data. But the logic of what this data bears out makes sense. Let me read this for you guys. This is very interesting. Worth the cost. When asked if the U.S. aid to Ukraine has been worth the cost, initially half said yes, while 35 said no. Okay, this seems to be somewhat correlative with the CNN data that we've seen. Okay. But with a little information, those numbers moved significantly. Respondents were told that the United States has spent roughly $24 billion on military aid to Ukraine, 3% of the U.S.'s own military budget, that Ukraine remains in control of roughly 83% of its territory, and that the war has severely degraded Russia's military power and its ability to threaten NATO allies. All of these things are true. Every single thing that was just said there is true. It is true. I think the only one that isn't true is you might be able to increase that military aid number to 30 billion or to maybe like 35 to 40 billion, depending on what you're counting. If you're double counting aid, because we send aid, we count the aid that has been sent and we count the replacements for including the replacement costs, which I always thought wasn't terrifically honest. If we're going to cover a tank, the cost of making a tank or buying a tank that we're not even sending to Ukraine as aid to Ukraine, if they don't get the aid, then why are we counting it? But all of this is true. And how does the public react to knowing this? After learning this, the number who said the U.S. aid has been worth it, that has been worth the cost, jumped to 64%. That is a 14% increase, including 77% of Democrats. That's a 12-point jump. And of Republicans, this is very significant because the Republican Party is the one that sees parts of its base most being against supporting Ukraine, sees an even bigger jump, an 18-point jump to 59%, meaning the majority of Republicans would then say that our aid was worth it, and 46% of independents getting a 5-point jump. Only 28% maintained. Only 28% maintain that the U.S. aid has not been worth the cost. This demonstrates that there exists a reservoir of support among the American people across party lines for assisting the Ukrainians in their fight for freedom. Leaders can tap into the reservoir by educating their fellow Americans and providing them with the context and details of U.S. support for the Ukrainian defense and its effects. Now, I think this is good data. I don't think their methodology, I think their methodology could be more strict and we can get more data that maybe is a little bit more accurate, but I believe the data bears out. I think it makes sense that once you tell Americans that, yes, actually, the Ukrainians control the majority of their land. They've taken back a decent amount of it. And this is only 3% of our military budget. And once they're actually given the numbers and they're given the data and they're told about the situation on the ground, I do think that's going to have an effect on them. Now, I think there's other information that you could give to people as well that I think would also encourage them to support Ukraine. Because a lot of things that I hear from Republicans a lot is they don't want America to be the policeman of the world. This is one of the main objections I hear to aid from Ukraine from Republicans that I know. That maybe they support Ukraine. If somebody supports Russia in this war, they might be almost a little too far gone in a lot of ways, but they support Ukraine, or they think the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves, but it isn't America's responsibility to be the policeman of the world. Something that I would point to is the other countries that have sent aid. I would talk about how the South Koreans, who aren't even in NATO, have transferred 500,000 shells to our reserve so we can send more to the Ukrainians. I would talk about the amount of tanks that Poland has sent. I would talk about the recent tanks that have been approved by Germany, 50 Leopard 1s to be sent over, even if 20 of them are going to be scrapped for parts. We can talk about the long-range Storm Shadow missiles that America wasn't willing to send ATACMS long-range missiles, but the Brits were. The Brits were also the first ones to agree to send Western-style tanks to Ukraine. We ended up agreeing to 31 Abrams, but it was the Brits who actually broke water on that. And if you go to a percentage of GDP, other states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Denmark, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, the United Kingdoms, the Czechs, all of these people, as a percentage of their GDP, even if it's not as a total number, has actually sent more in assistance to the Ukrainians than us. If you make it clear that this is not an American police operation, but this is a support effort through a coalition, through a number of NATO and EU countries, our historical allies, as well as other countries around the world, like Japan and South Korea, who aren't in NATO, but are supporting Ukraine. I think if you gave people this information, that you talk about the victories that Ukraine has had with American aid, if you talk about how the other countries are stepping up as a percentage of their GDP, they're actually even sending more than us. Definitely the ones that are most determinant, their futures are most determinant on the outcome, like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. Not a big surprise that they're the leading countries here. If you include the actual numbers about what we sent over to Ukraine, then I do think that actually is going to increase the amount of support amongst the population, because the numbers you hear are like 200 billion, 300 billion, 400 billion. RFK on Joe Rogan's podcast at one point said like $1.8 trillion we've spent on the war in Ukraine. That's one of the most, if not the most popular podcasts in America. And that's the type of nonsense that's being peddled. When the most realistic estimation, highest estimation that you want to do if you talk about military aid is 45 to 50. And he's saying 1.8 trillion. He's in fucking la land when we're trying to have a serious conversation about how this war is going to be financed and supplied and how we're going to up artillery production. And that's how RFK is talking about the war. It's not the only time RFK has lied about the war on a very popular program. When Tucker Carlson still had his job before he got booted for being a liar, and for causing Fox News a gigantic lawsuit and costing him a lot of money. Part of the reason, not the only reason, but part of the reason the lawsuit went through. While he was on Tucker Carlson's show, he also pushed lies about the war that I think would make many Americans oppose the war if they believed it. And it was a lie that Tucker Carlson said multiple times on this program, which I want to emphasize to you was the number one cable news show in the United States. So if you've got the number one podcast in the United States spreading misinformation about the war on that location, on that podcast, and you've got this guy also spreading misinformation on the most powerful and the largest and most popular show in cable news, then it's not surprising that we're seeing more people turn against the war if they believe actual bullshit. And this is the number I'm talking about right now. The number I want to make sure I mention it so you can understand how it could turn somebody against supporting Ukraine. What RFK said and what Tucker Carlson said on another occasion as well, a week before RFK was on his program, and I've heard this number repeated in a lot of right-wing circles online because they heard it on Tucker Carlson's program. The number was that for every Russian soldier that dies, 7 Ukrainian soldiers die. That's what Tucker Carlson said. That's what RFK said. That's what has been said time and time again about or by their lackeys or by the people who simp up to them. Have heard that information and spread it online. The only problem is it's completely made up. Somebody went and took the Jack Textera leaks, the leaks from the National Guardsmen that happened a few months ago that everybody remembers, that revealed some information on the war when it comes to air defenses, when it comes to trainers for the Ukrainian military. Somebody took one of those documents, one of the pages of those documents that estimated casualty numbers, and edited it and photoshopped it. And they didn't even Photoshop it quite well. They actually photoshopped it in a garbage way. They made it look terrible. You can see the letters were kind of like cut in half. The coloration was different on the paper between the area that was photoshopped and the rest of the area. And they didn't Photoshop the rest of the documents. And so in the other documents in the leak, it would reference the original numbers and the other pages of the documents, which still said the original number, not the new edited number. But either Tucker Carlson saw that on his Twitter feed or saw that somewhere, RFK similar, and just did no digging. And Fox never issued a correction, by the way. I do want to throw that out there. Fox still hasn't issued a correction. And they just bought it on face value. Or maybe it was more malicious and they were just literally just stating blatant lies, hoping to undercut support for the war, repeating what is pro-Russian propaganda. The actual numbers in the Jack Textera documents for the casualty numbers is for every Ukrainian soldier that dies, 2.5 Russian soldiers die. Do you think if an American hears for every Ukrainian soldier, for every Russian soldier dies, 7 Ukrainians die, do you think hearing that might affect their want to continue to support Ukraine? Absolutely. Because if that number is true, the Ukrainians have no chance of success. Definitely, since the Russians have a much larger population to them. But they aren't true. The numbers were really, from those internal documents, for every Ukrainian that dies, 2.5 Russians die. If you hear that number instead of that original lie, I think that would affect your view of the war. There has been so much misinformation and so many lies about this war pushed on some of the most popular news programs in the country. No wonder we're seeing support go down like this. People hear these 200 billion numbers on military aid, complete lie. People hear the death toll numbers from Tucker Carlson, from RFK, complete lies. People hear about this nonsense about a CIA coup in Ukraine, that this is actually all our fault. They hear it from fools like Jimmy Dore and others on the more niche programs online. All lies. Is it really surprising that we're seeing more support turn against the war? Obviously, a percentage of the support is going to be people who have just decided, you know what? America's for America. It is what it is. It's not our business, not our trouble, no matter how bad it is over there. That they accept, they know the numbers, they know the true information, but they accept it for what it is, and they disregard it. They disregard aid to Ukraine. They don't want to do it because that's their values. They believe that we should be isolationist. Of course, that's a percentage of them. But it's impossible for me not to think, with so many lies going around the ecosphere, pushed by fearmongers like Tucker Carlson, who also on his new Twitter show alleged that Ukraine blew up the Novakhovka Dam, by the way, just showing you that he's still pushing these lies, even though he no longer has his Fox show. It's impossible for me not to think that that had a real impact, and not a negligible impact, not a small impact, a real impact. Most popular podcast in America, most popular cable news show in America. You don't think that can have an impact? I think it can. And so I think it is the job of people who support Ukraine, both on cable news, both on alternative programs, with the think tanks, with the lobbyist groups, to make sure that they keep the populace informed. That they say, hey, let's talk about a military aid. But also, America's not the one sending the most military aid as a percentage of GDP. Let's talk about the other states that are supporting Ukraine. I think maybe there should be more coverage on that, because I know programs like DW, which is not an extremely popular program in the United States, but they do have an English channel, talk about that a lot more. They talk about the international view of the conflict a lot more. That should be emphasized more. I think if they knew that we're not alone in this struggle, that the Europeans are also doing their best to supply Ukraine, they should do more. I think if we actually brought more attention to it, maybe we could pressure for the French more. Because look down there. Look at where the French are. 0.05%. That's pathetic, man. The Germans used to get criticized all the time for slow walking support for Ukraine. Now the French are barely on the map here. They're barely on the map. Japan, as a percentage of GDP, has supplied more aid. That's ridiculous. That is ridiculous. Maybe the coup in Niger, which seems to be aligning itself with the Wagner group, is going to give France the kick in the ass it needs to pick up support and aid. Who knows? But if you include the real numbers, and we have data that bears this out, if you include the real numbers, if you include the state of the war, the more that American voters are informed about what's really happening on the ground, the more likely they are to support aid to Ukraine. Period. End of paragraph. That's what all the data bears out. And it makes logical sense. It makes logical sense that if they knew this information that is kept from them by many, not only conspiracy theorists and people like Tucker, but information that is left out by a lot of more mainstream publications that you would think would be very supportive of Ukraine. If they included this information, I think we would see support for Ukraine either stabilize or even increase. I 100% believe that. So I think it is on us, on the responsibilities on people like me as a freelance reporter and other people covering the conflict to not only get louder, but make sure that people have proper context. Democracy is its most successful when we have an informed voter pool. So the job is now to inform the voter pool going into 2024.